Sophie Chen had always seen the world differently. While other kids her age were scrolling through phones and chasing trends, Sophie was chasing light, the way it fell through autumn leaves, the way it reflected off wet pavement after rain, the way it transformed ordinary moments into something worth remembering. She was 17 years old in the spring of 1967, living in Los Angeles with her parents and younger brother. Her bedroom was more studio than sleeping space. Canvases stacked against every wall. Paint tubes scattered across her desk like a rainbow exploded. Her mother would complain about the turpentine smell seeping into the hallway, but she'd say it with a smile because everyone knew that painting wasn't just Sophie's hobby. It was her oxygen. Sophie had been accepted to the California College of Arts and Crafts for the fall. Full scholarship. Her teacher said she had a gift, that rare combination of technical skill and emotional depth that couldn't be taught. Her paintings had a quality that made people stop and feel something, really feel it. A landscape wasn't just trees and sky in Sophie's hands. It was memory, longing, hope, all translated into color and form. She'd spend hours at Venice Beach, sketching the vendors and the tourists, the street performers and the surfers. She painted the city at dawn when it was still sleepy and soft. She painted it at midnight when it pulsed with neon and possibility. Every canvas told a story, and Sophie had 1,000 stories she wanted to tell. Then came the headaches. At first, they were easy to ignore. Stress from finishing high school, her mother said. Too much time staring at canvases, her father suggested. But the headaches got worse. Then came the fatigue that wouldn't lift no matter how much she slept. Then the dizziness that made her drop her paintbrush mid-stroke. The day Sophie collapsed in art class, everything changed. The diagnosis and financial devastation. Dr. Richardson's office smelled like antiseptic and something else. Something Sophie would later recognize as a scent of bad news delivered too many times. The doctor was kind, which somehow made it worse. He had a gentle voice and sad eyes, and when he said the word lymphoma, Sophie watched her mother's hand fly to her mouth, and her father's shoulders slump like someone had cut his strings. Stage 3 Hodgkin's lymphoma. Aggressive, treatable, but the treatment would be brutal and expensive. Chemotherapy, radiation, hospital stays, medications that cost more per dose than her father made in a week. Richardson worked as a bookkeeper for a small import company. Sophie's mother, Linda, cleaned houses for wealthy families in Beverly Hills. They weren't poor, but they weren't wealthy either. They existed in that precarious middle space where one medical emergency could topple everything they'd built. And this wasn't just one emergency. This was sustained assault on their finances that would last months, maybe years. The hospital financial counselor laid it out in numbers that didn't make sense until you really looked at them. Each round of chemotherapy, $3,000. She'd need at least 6 rounds, probably more. Hospital stays, $500 per day. Medications, hundreds per week. Follow-up care, tests, monitoring. The bills would keep coming long after the treatment ended. Their insurance would cover some of it. Not enough. Not nearly enough. The counselor mentioned payment plans, medical loans, fundraisers. She mentioned the word bankruptcy with practiced delicacy, like it was just another option on a menu of terrible choices. That night, Sophie lay in bed listening to her parents argue in hushed, desperate voices through the thin walls. Her father wanted to sell the house. Her mother was researching second mortgages. They were talking about pulling her brother out of private school, selling the car, taking out loans they'd never be able to repay. They were going to destroy themselves trying to save her. Sophie stared at the ceiling, at the glow-in-the-dark stars she'd stuck there when she was 9, and made a decision. She couldn't stop them from fighting for her life, but she could fight alongside them. She could contribute. She could do something. She had no job, no savings, no wealthy relatives to call. What she had were 53 completed paintings, a dozen sketches worth finishing, and 2 hands that could still hold a brush even when the rest of her body wanted to give up. If she was going to undergo chemotherapy, if she was going to let poison pump through her veins in the hope of killing cancer before it killed her, then she was going to pay for as much of it as she possibly could. She was going to sell her art. The decision to paint for survival. The corner of Melrose Avenue and North Highland was busy enough to get foot traffic, but not so expensive that she'd need a permit she couldn't afford. Sophie scouted a location on a Tuesday morning, 2 days before her first chemotherapy session, when she still had the energy to walk 3 blocks without needing to rest. She borrowed a folding table from a neighbor, carried it to the corner herself even though it made her arms shake with effort. She used cardboard boxes to prop up her paintings, arranged them so the light would hit them just right. Her best landscapes in front, the portraits on the sides, the abstract pieces in the back for people who wanted to browse. The hardest part was the sign. Sophie sat on the curb with a piece of poster board and a black marker, trying to find words that were honest without being pitiful, that explained without begging. She went through 4 drafts, crumpling each one with frustration, before settling on simple truth. The sign read, "Original artwork by Sophie Chen. I'm 17 and fighting cancer. Every painting sold helps pay for my treatment. Thank you for looking." She taped it to the front of the table, stepped back to see how it looked, and immediately wanted to tear it down. It felt like advertising her weakness, putting her desperation on display for strangers to judge. But pride was a luxury she couldn't afford anymore, so she left it there. The first painting she sold was a sunset over the Venice Beach Pier, all oranges and purples, and that particular quality of California light that tourists couldn't get enough of. She'd priced it at $45, knowing it was worth more but desperate to make any sale at all. A woman in her 30s bought it on Sophie's second day there, paid in cash, and told Sophie to stay strong. Sophie thanked her and meant it, even though $45 would cover maybe an hour of treatment, a single medication, a drop in an ocean of debt. But it was a start. The chemotherapy began that Friday. They put her in a chair that reclined like it was trying to be comfortable, but failed. Hooked her up to and for that drip poison into her bloodstream with mechanical indifference. The chemicals were supposed to target the cancer cells, but they didn't discriminate much. They attacked everything, turning her own body into a battlefield where she was both soldier and casualty. Within a week, Sophie's hair started falling out. Within 2 weeks, she couldn't keep food down. Within 3 weeks, she understood why people called it fighting cancer, because every morning she woke up felt like she'd gone 12 rounds with an opponent determined to break her. But she kept painting. On her good days, when the nausea wasn't too bad and she had enough strength to hold a brush steady, she'd add new pieces to her collection, mostly smaller works now, because her stamina wouldn't sustain anything requiring hours of focus. Quick studies, impressions, moments captured before the fatigue dragged her back to bed. On her bad days, she'd drag herself to that corner anyway, setting up her table even when standing felt like climbing a mountain. She'd sit on a folding chair she'd added to her setup, bundled in a sweater even when the weather was warm, a scarf covering her bald head, and she'd wait for someone, anyone, to see value in what she created. Days of struggle and rejection. Most people didn't stop. Sophie learned this quickly. In a city like Los Angeles, everyone was going somewhere, chasing something, too busy or too focused to notice a sick girl selling paintings on a street corner. They'd walk past with their eyes forward, locked on whatever destination justified their hurry. Some people noticed but looked away, uncomfortable with the reality her sign presented. Cancer was scary. Teenagers with cancer were scarier. It was easier to pretend they hadn't seen, to keep walking, to preserve the fiction that bad things only happen to other people. A few people stopped to look, but not to buy. They'd browse her paintings with the casual interest of window shoppers, offer encouraging words that cost them nothing and move on. "These are really good," they'd say. "I hope you get better." Then they'd disappear into the crowd, leaving Sophie alone with her hope and her inventory and the growing understanding that sympathy didn't pay medical bills. The worst were the ones who questioned her. A man in his 50s stopped one afternoon, read her sign, and asked if she was really sick or if this was some kind of scam. Sophie pulled her scarf back slightly, showing him her bald head, the port in her chest where they administered the chemotherapy. The man flushed red, mumbled an apology, and left without buying anything. A woman lectured her about alternative treatments, insisted that chemotherapy was poison, and Sophie should be drinking wheatgrass juice and meditating instead. Sophie listened politely because what else could she do? Thanked her for the advice, and watched her walk away feeling virtuous for caring without actually helping. Teenagers her own age were the most painful. They'd stop in groups, point at her paintings, whisper to each other, sometimes laugh at things Sophie couldn't hear. They had their whole lives stretching ahead of them, unmarked by illness or desperation. They had the luxury of treating her art stand like an oddity, entertainment, something to mention later when sharing stories about their day. Sophie tried not to hate them for it. They were just kids. They didn't understand yet that life could fracture without warning, that health was a gift you didn't appreciate until it was taken. Her parents came by during lunch breaks when they could, brought her soup she couldn't eat, worried openly about her sitting outside in the sun when her immune system was compromised. Her father wanted her to come home, rest, let them handle finances. Her mother cried when she saw how thin Sophie had gotten, how the treatment was hollowing her out from the inside. But Sophie refused to quit. Every painting sold was a small victory. $20 here, $50 there, occasionally $100 when someone saw enough value to pay what the work was actually worth. She kept a notebook logging every sale, running a tally that climbed with painful slowness toward a goal she knew was unreachable but chased anyway. 3 weeks in, she made $835, enough to cover maybe 2 days of hospital care, a handful of medications, a fraction of a single chemotherapy session. It should have felt hopeless. It would have, except Sophie had learned something about herself during those weeks on that corner. She learned that she was stubborn enough to keep painting when her hands shook from weakness, brave enough to sit outside when every instinct said to hide, strong enough to smile at strangers even when her body felt like it was eating itself from within. The money mattered, but so did this, the act of fighting, the refusal to surrender, the daily choice to show up and create something beautiful in the middle of everything ugly and unfair. She was painting her way through cancer, not around it or away from it, but straight through the middle of it. And if that wasn't going to save her life, at least it would prove she'd lived it on her terms until the very end. Then, on a Thursday afternoon in late June, when the sun was hot and Sophie was tired and her inventory was down to 17 unsold paintings, a man in a charcoal gray suit stopped at her table. Dean Martin arrives. He didn't look like he belonged on a street corner in the middle of the afternoon. The suit was tailored, expensive, the kind worn by men who spent their days in boardrooms or on movie sets. He had dark sunglasses that hid his eyes and a confidence in his posture that suggested he was used to people looking at him, even when they didn't recognize him. Sophie noticed him because he didn't just glance and keep walking. He stopped completely, positioned himself in front of her table, and actually looked at the paintings. Really looked, his head tilted slightly as he studied a landscape of Griffith Park she'd painted from memory, moved to a portrait of an elderly woman feeding pigeons, paused longest at an abstract piece that captured the chaos Sophie felt during her worst days of treatment. Most people who stopped scanned her work in 30 seconds and made their decision. This man took his time. Minutes passed. He seemed genuinely interested, not just curious or killing time. "These are yours," he asked finally, his voice smooth and warm, with an East Coast edge softened by years in California. "Yes, sir," Sophie said, sitting up straighter in her chair even though the movement made her dizzy. "How long have you been painting?" "Since I was 7. Seriously, since I was 12. He nodded, still looking at the canvases. "You can tell. There's maturity here, understanding of light and composition you don't usually see in young artists." He glanced at her sign, read it without comment, looked back at the paintings. "What's the story behind these?" Sophie had learned to read people during her weeks at this corner. She could spot the ones who asked questions because they cared versus the ones who asked because they thought they should. This man genuinely wanted to know, so she told him. She told him about the diagnosis, about sitting in Dr. Richardson's office while he explained how her own cells had turned against her. She told him about the chemotherapy, about how the treatment meant to save her life felt like it was killing her slowly. She told him about her parents working themselves to exhaustion, about medical bills that arrived with the regularity and weight of judgments. She told him how painting was the only thing that made sense anymore, the only part of her life that felt like it belonged to her rather than to the disease. Every canvas was a small rebellion, proof that cancer could take her energy and her hair and her certainty about the future, but it couldn't take this. her ability to see beauty and translate it into something others could feel. The man listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, still studying the paintings. "Which one means the most to you?" he asked. Sophie pointed to a smaller canvas, barely 12 by 16 inches. It showed a single window with dawn light streaming through, illuminating dust particles in the air. She'd painted the morning after her first chemotherapy session, when she'd woken up sick and scared but had forced herself to find something worth capturing. That one. It reminds me that every day I wake up is a gift, even the hard ones, especially the hard ones. The man picked up the canvas, examined it closely, turned it to see how the light played across the brushstrokes. Then he did something Sophie didn't expect. He smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his entire face. "This is real talent," he said. "Not potential. Not promise. Real talent right now." He pulled out a leather checkbook from his inside jacket pocket. Clicked the pen. "What are you asking for this piece?" $35, Sophie said, her voice barely above a whisper. The man wrote for a few seconds, tore out the check, and handed it to her. "I think this is worth more than that." Sophie looked down at the check, and her breath stopped. $5,000. She looked up at him, certain there had been a mistake, that he'd added too many zeros or written the wrong amount. "Sir, This must be wrong. I said 35. "I heard you," he said calmly. "I'm saying I think your work is worth more. Much more." He removed his sunglasses, and Sophie's confusion transformed into shock as she recognized the face underneath. Dean Martin. The Dean Martin, one of the most famous entertainers in the world, known for his smooth voice and effortless charisma, a member of the Rat Pack, a man who commanded stages and screens with the casual confidence of someone born to perform. He was standing at her art table, having just written her a check that would cover months of treatment. I can't accept this," Sophie stammered, even as her hands shook holding the check. "It's too much. I didn't." "You created something beautiful," Dean interrupted gently. "I'm paying for that beauty. This isn't charity. Sophie, this is an investment in an artist I believe in." He tucked the painting under his arm. "You got something special. Don't let the cancer convince you otherwise. Keep painting, no matter what happens. Promise me that." Sophie's eyes filled with tears. "I promise." "Good." Dean put his sunglasses back on, gave her a warm smile. "Your work reminds me why art matters. It shows people how to see the world differently, how to find light even in dark times. That's worth more than any check I could write." He started to walk away, then turned back. "One more thing. That determination you have, that refusal to quit, that's going to beat this disease. I can see it in your paintings. You're a fighter, Sophie Chen. Keep fighting." Then Dean Martin walked down Melrose Avenue, carrying a small painting of dawn light streaming through a window, leaving Sophie sitting at her table with a $5,000 check and a strange, overwhelming sense that her entire life had just shifted on its axis. The aftermath and transformation. Word spread faster than Sophie could have imagined. A bystander who'd witnessed the exchange called a friend at the Los Angeles Times. A photographer happened to walk by 10 minutes later, captured Sophie sitting at her table still crying, still staring at the check. By evening, reporters were showing up, asking for interviews, wanted to know the details of what Dean Martin had done and why. Sophie told the story honestly, without embellishment, because the truth was extraordinary enough. A famous entertainer had stopped at her sidewalk art stand, appreciated her work, and paid her far more than she'd asked. He'd treated her not as a charity case, but as a real artist whose work had genuine value. The story appeared in the next morning's paper with the headline, "Teen Fighting Cancer Gets Lifeline from Dean Martin." By noon, there was a line of people at Sophie's corner. They came to see the girl from the article, to buy whatever painting she had left, to be part of a story that felt good in a world that often didn't. Sophie sold all 17 remaining paintings by 2 p.m., but people kept coming. They wanted to commission new work, asked if she took orders, left their contact information and specific requests. A gallery owner from Beverly Hills stopped by, said he'd love to feature her work in a group show when she was healthy enough. A documentary filmmaker asked if she'd be willing to let him film her painting, tell her story in depth. The attention was overwhelming. Sophie, who'd spent weeks being invisible on that corner, suddenly couldn't escape notice. Camera crews showed up. Strangers stopped her on the street to wish her well. The story went national, picked up by newspapers and television stations across the country. Through it all, the money came, not just from painting sales, but from people who'd read the story and wanted to help. Checks arrived at her house with notes from strangers in Ohio and Maine and Texas, people who'd been moved by her determination and wanted to contribute to her treatment fund. Small amounts, mostly $10 or $20, but they added up with shocking speed. Within a week of Dean Martin's visit, Sophie had raised over $30,000. Her parents wept when they saw the total, not just from relief. Though there was plenty of that, they wept because the response proved something they'd been afraid to believe. That people were fundamentally good, that strangers care about a sick teenager they'd never met, that humanity could surprise you with its capacity for kindness. Sophie's next chemotherapy session was fully paid for, and the one after that, and all the ones following. For the first time since her diagnosis, money wasn't the primary source of fear. She could focus entirely on fighting the cancer without the background terror of bankruptcy destroying her family. The treatment was still brutal. The nausea still came in waves that left her hollow and weak. Her body still ached from the poison coursing through her veins, doing its violent work of seeking out and destroying rogue cells. But somehow it felt more bearable knowing that thousands of people were rooting for her, that her fight had meaning beyond mere survival. She kept painting through it all. On her good days, she'd set up her table again, not because she needed to sell artwork anymore, but because it had become her routine, her purpose, her way of staying connected to the world outside hospital rooms and illness. People would stop just to talk, to see how she was doing, to watch her work. An elderly man became a regular visitor, showing up every Thursday to see her latest piece and share stories about his own daughter who died of cancer 20 years earlier. A young couple bought 3 paintings over the course of 2 months, telling Sophie her art was the first they'd ever collected, that they wanted to remember her story. A mother brought her own sick child, a little boy fighting leukemia, because she wanted him to see that other people were fighting too, that he wasn't alone in his battle. Sophie painted him a picture of a superhero on the spot, told him that's what he was, told him keep fighting no matter what. The gallery show happened in September. Sophie had to wear a mask because her immune system was still compromised, could only stay for an hour before exhaustion claimed her, but she stood in that Beverly Hills gallery surrounded by her paintings and felt something she hadn't felt in months. Pride, not just in her art, but in herself. She'd been diagnosed with cancer and had refused to let it define her entire existence. She'd found a way to fight back, to contribute, to transform her struggle into something that helped others see beauty and possibility even in the darkest circumstances. And it had started because Dean Martin had stopped at her table. The deeper impact and legacy. Sophie's cancer went into remission in November 1967, 6 months after that afternoon on Melrose Avenue. The doctors cautiously used words like successful response and encouraging signs, avoiding the word cured, because cancer was a disease that required humility and uncertainty. But Sophie was alive, weak, exhausted, changed by the experience in ways both visible and invisible, but alive. She didn't return to school that fall. Instead, she painted, order after order, commission after commission, building a portfolio and a reputation that had nothing to do with her illness and everything to do with her talent. The cancer had opened doors, but her skill kept them open. By 1969, Sophie had her first solo exhibition. By 1971, her work was being collected by museums. By 1975, she was teaching art to other young people fighting serious illnesses, using painting as therapy and purpose and defiance against diseases that try to steal everything. She never forgot that Thursday afternoon, though. Never forgot the moment Dean Martin stopped at her table and chose to see an artist rather than a sick kid. He'd given her more than money that day. He'd given her validation, proof that her work had value independent of her circumstances, that she was more than her diagnosis. Sophie wrote him a letter after she went into remission, thanking him for what he'd done. She included a small painting of the corner where they'd met, titled Where Everything Changed. Dean wrote back with a note that Sophie framed and kept on her studio wall for the rest of her life. "Keep making beauty, Sophie. The world needs all you can give." The story became part of Dean Martin's legacy, mentioned in articles and documentaries about his life and career. People talked about his talent and his famous friendships, but they also talked about the time he stopped at a teenager's art stand and changed her life with a single act of generosity. What they didn't always mention was that it wasn't really about the money. The $5,000 mattered. Certainly, it paid for treatment, eased her family's burden, bought time and hope when both were in short supply. But what mattered more was the gesture itself. The fact that one of the busiest, most famous men in America had taken time to truly see her work, to appreciate it, to invest in it. In a world that often treated sick people as object of pity, Dean had treated Sophie as an artist. In a culture that saw teenagers as incomplete adults, he'd seen her as a complete person worthy of respect. In a moment when Sophie desperately needed to believe her life had purpose beyond merely surviving, he'd shown her that it did. That was the real gift. Not the check, but the recognition. The reminder that she was still Sophie Chen, the girl who saw the world in colors and light, who translated emotions into brushstrokes, who created beauty because she couldn't help herself. Cancer had tried to reduce her to a diagnosis, a set of symptoms, a tragic story. Dean Martin had seen past all of that to the artist underneath and had said, simply and clearly, "Your work matters. You matter." Sometimes saving someone's life isn't about medicine or money. Sometimes it's about seeing them when others look away, believing in them when they're struggling to believe in themselves, and showing them that their gifts have value even, especially, when everything else feels uncertain. August 12, 1967, the day a teenage artist fighting cancer met a legendary entertainer who stopped long enough to truly see her. The day $5,000 bought more than chemotherapy treatments. The day Sophie Chen learned that her art could save her in ways that went far beyond the practical. The day that proved sometimes a single moment of recognition and kindness can change everything. That's a story worth remembering.